Hi, everybody. This is Brian Reardon with the S-Corp Association. Thank you for joining us today. We've got as our guests for this webinar our friends Myra Miller and David Winston from the Winston Group. We've worked with Myra and David in the past to focus on Main Street tax issues. And this time around, what we asked them to do was put together a presentation that focuses on the big tax bill that just passed back on, the President signed it on July 4th, and the particular provisions within it, particularly the Main Street provisions, but all of them, take a look at all of them, and get a sense of which provisions are popular, how the bill itself is playing with the public, and how groups like S-Corp and our Main Street Coalition can focus on, the different messaging and the different provisions that we can focus on to make sure that voters, make sure that, our members understand exactly how they benefited from the bill. Everybody assumes that once you pass a tax bill, it's like easy, right? People get tax cuts and they're all happy, but that's not the way it works out. One of the challenges that I've noticed in many, many years of doing this is that you have to make clear, you have to make the case for how people got the tax cut and whether they got a tax cut. Remember back in 2001, 2003, I was involved in those efforts. We sent out checks to people, we sent out checks to families, and still you had a very low level of folks recognizing that they got a tax cut, despite the fact that every family in the United States of America got a tax cut in those bills. So it's not something that you can just assume that your audience knows they got a tax cut. You have to work at it. You have to focus on the specifics in the bill. And I think that's what David and Myra are going to cover here today. So Myra, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Let me go ahead and fire up the screen here. There are going to be two levels that we're going to be looking at here. One specifically sort of a broader national level context in terms of where things are, and then specifically in terms of the survey that Brian had us do in Georgia, where you can see sort of a practical application here and sort of understanding of the dynamics of how it's going to sort of impact the discourse as we move forward. So with that, just so you know, in terms of the national, this is a survey that was done at the end of August, beginning of September, and then the Georgia survey was done middle of September. And what we're going to cover here is sort of, again, outlook for the bill nationally and in Georgia. And Myra specifically is going to do a deep dive into issues for small and family-owned businesses within the context of this. But to set this all up, I want to go back to 2024. And not that anybody needs reminding of this, and the dominant issue was inflation. And during President Biden's term, prices went up 21.4%. And obviously a significant level, the largest we've seen since the early 80s, 1982 to be specific, in terms of when it reached over 9% in the summer of 22. One of the dynamics of this election, interestingly enough, was that this was actually the first time in a presidential cycle where Republicans, this is exit poll data, 1984 forward. The blue line is Democrats, the red line is Republicans, and the green line is independents. And Republicans had a 3-point advantage here, or I'm sorry, a 4-point advantage. There was a significant dynamic in terms of this election. And notice the one thing in terms of what generated that, it wasn't so much the Republicans improved, actually they went down 1 point, but Democrats went from 37 to 31, showing you the level of dissatisfaction amongst Democrats in terms of what was happening in terms of inflation. And as you can see here, in terms of the rise of independents actually increased by 7 points. So those people, it's not like they became Republicans. They just decided not to affiliate with either party, moving away from Democrats. And so what you actually see here is Democrats in this particular election were actually in third place behind independents as well. And why are independents so important? Well, if you take a look here, in terms of the last, the years that are in red are years when the House flipped from Democrat to Republican, and the years in blue are when they would flip from Republican to Democrat. And then we put 2024 in, which didn't flip either direction. And what you see in terms of 94, 2006, 2010, and 2018, irregardless of which party was taking over, was that it took double-digit wins in terms of independents to create a significant level of seats. In the case, the results here were all 230 and above in terms of outcome. And if you take a look at 2022, first thing to note is in prior years for Republicans, they didn't have a party ID advantage yet. In 2022, they had that party ID advantage, but they lost independents by 2, as opposed to in 2010 when they won them by 19. So that 21-point swing resulted in a difference of 20 seats. In 2010, we won 242. In 2022, it was only 222. So even though Republicans had the significant advantage in 2022, in terms of party identification, that didn't really translate into a major win. And basically what we're showing here in 2024 is basically a rerun of 2022. So the key thing here to take away is independents in terms of the prior elections where you saw flips played a decisive role. Currently, people's attitude about the direction of the country, and this is pretty similar to a lot of surveys out there at this point. There's not disagreement at all really in terms of this. Right direction, wrong track, 38-53 for the country. And in terms of the economy, it's 37-52. And the reason for that that negative view of the economy is when you pose the question, do you think inflation is getting better or worse? 52% think it's getting worse. Only 23% say better. 22% is not changing, which is not necessarily good for the administration. And you see this reflected in terms of issue handling. What this is, we did a post-election back in 2024, and what you see is Republicans had really good advantages, particularly in terms of inflation, the economy +12, +11, and you can see now that that's dropped off quite a bit in terms of going from inflation +12 to -3, favoring Democrats by 3, the economy +11 for Republicans down to +1. So what you're looking at is an electorate that's uncertain in terms of where the economy is going. They're not necessarily going to Democrats, but they're clearly not sure about where Republicans are at. So if you take what I want to look through next is the state of the bill and pass-through issues, specifically looking at Georgia. The first thing to note, and I'm going to give you sort of a kind of a political overview in terms of Georgia, at least where the parties stand and where voters are a bit. What you see is it's been pretty consistent over time with the exception of 2022. In 2022, there were 9 statewide races, 8 of which were run Republicans. Unfortunately for Republicans of the Senate, the only one that didn't go that direction was Herschel Walker in the Senate. And so you saw a slight uptick in terms of Republicans because, again, it was just a strong Republican ticket that year. And you see that in 2024, it sort of bounced back. The key thing about Georgia, in terms of thinking through, is it's a center-right state. And what we did is we posed this question. You're going to see a variety of people that we put up here. We asked people to identify themselves on a scale of 1 to 9, 1 being very liberal, 9 being very conservative. They place themselves center-right, 5.72. And when you look at the political center in terms of independence, basically you're looking at the same number as well. When you take a look at the two parties, at least in terms of looking at the Senate, because that's what we were looking at, you see that by a significant margin, people view Democrats much farther to the left, almost by twice the margin than where they view Republicans in the Senate. And when you look at where people perceive John Ossoff, actually basically where Democrats are in the Senate, so they see him to the left, but not necessarily farther to the left than Democrats in the Senate. When you look at where people perceive Donald Trump, farther to the right, Republicans in the Senate, you see that Kemp is viewed closer to the ideology of the state. And interestingly enough, Raphael Warnock is actually viewed farther to the left than John Ossoff. And obviously one of the challenges there for Republicans is that Warnock won. And so John Ossoff's, some of his identifying him as a sort of leftist, given the fact that Warnock was actually farther to the left, it's going to be more of a challenging dynamic in terms of that political discourse, in terms of how that race gets defined. So with that, in terms of looking at the tax bill overall, and this is within the state, So do you think inflation is getting better or worse? And what you see is again, very similar to the national level numbers, 52% worse, 24% said better, not particularly different from the national numbers. When you look at the overall bill, though, we ask people, given what you've heard about this, do you favor or oppose? What you see is 45% favor, 47% oppose. So it's pretty much of an even split. Again, you've got a center-right electorate. They're evenly split given what they've heard. In terms of the critical element here is, do you think this bill does or does not prevent a tax increase? And this is what Brian was talking about earlier, the sense of what was occurring. Did they actually avoid a tax increase? And in many cases, and you'll see Myra describe some of this, that's in large part because they didn't know they got one, to Brian's point. And so what you see, that 32% of the state thought they did get this did prevent a tax increase, 48% did not. Amongst independents, a similar number, a little bit wider margin of 25 to 53. Why does this matter so much? Well, if you take a look at this in terms of support for the bill, if you thought it did provide a tax break, avoiding a tax break, 81% favored, 80% opposed, 18% opposed. If you thought it didn't stop a tax increase, it was 2173. This is again very similar to national numbers. In Georgia, specifically, on the does, the 81% is larger than the national number, which was at 74. But you can see that this is sort of a decisive element. And so we posed statements to sort of understand the belief systems underlying how people got to conclusions. And if you take a look, the top three here, the bill increase, and the reason for this is, again, as Myra show, if you don't believe something happened, then why talk about that? I mean, you've got to then come up with something else to get people to actually get to that belief. The first thing to note here, the challenge is nothing in terms of the belief statements is over 50%. Although the top three tend to be the strongest of the three. The first one, the bill increased the child tax credit, eliminated taxes on overtime and tips, and gave a new $6,000 tax credit deduction to seniors, 49 to 30, so a good positive number. Interesting enough, the number two is basically dealing with 199As. The bill protected over 700,000 Georgia small businesses from higher tax rates up to 43.4% if the Trump tax had expired. And you see by a margin of 42 to 33, people believe that. And then the third one was dealing with the standard deduction that the bill prevented over 1 million families from seeing, or I'm sorry, child tax credit rather, seeing the child tax credit cut in half. What's interesting out of this is the small business argument is actually the number two argument here in terms of the bill as people see it. Inversely, and here's the challenge, when you actually get into the specifics of the bill, because they don't know that much about it, those were marginally understood overall in terms of like how much would have been taxes would have gone up, and looking at the standard deduction having been cut in half, much less believable than the other three above. But critically, in terms of moving forward, thinking about next year, if you take a look at my apologies here. If you take a look at the bottom statement, that the bill is working for working Georgia families, you see that at least at this point, there's not a sense of that occurring. So with that, in terms of the arguments, in terms of opposed, what you see here is generally they're all over 50%. And you see Medicaid and dealing with food programs for the poor. These are strong arguments, but they have more standing because the economic arguments have not been effectively made at a personal level. That people understood what was occurring in terms of the fact that they avoided a tax increase and other dynamics. These arguments wouldn't be as strong, but without the strong standing of those, that's the challenge. So in looking at issues for small and
Hey,
family.
David, do you mind, is it okay if I jump in here? Can you go
Yep,
back to the previous slide?
this one.
One more. Yeah. So what strikes me is that, the most favorable statement is the one where you talk about child credit, overtime, and the deduction for seniors. So all these things are accurate. All these things were in the bill. The only thing the president talks about is that first one, right? And that's where you get the good number. And, to my intro point, which is unless we talk about the specifics of what's in the bill, people aren't going to believe that it's actually in the bill, right? And if you don't talk about it, how would they know? And so when the president talks about tax bill, he talks about taxes on overtime and eliminating them, right? So people believe, oh yeah, I've heard that. That's in the bill, right? And you get a good number. If you go to the negative slide, the next slide, we hear nothing but, people are going to lose their health care through Medicaid under this bill, right? So they believe that. So the challenge for us is the folks who, asked for this bill, got it, and now we have to make sure that people understand what they got, right? So if
Yeah,
we don't talk about it, voters out there don't know, and they're not going to be supportive.
and if I may, going to these 2 points, these to your point, these are actually true points,
Yeah.
right? But they have no idea because again, many of them didn't realize they got the tax cut back in 2017, right? So how were they avoiding that? So let me go through the issues for small family business. I'm going to start off with this, and then I'm going to have Myra take over. Okay, the critical number here, just in terms of just the sort of brand image of small business at this point, is that within the state, 89% have a favorable view of small and family-owned businesses. 5% have a negative view. With independents, it's virtually the same. Here's what this means. This means when somebody brings up this topic, the initial reaction is, oh, this is something I'm favorable about. I want to hear what's said. Having said that, now going back to what Brian was talking, those believe, not believe statements, right? They're willing to listen to what you're going to say, but what you have to say, they also have to believe it. And if they
Yeah.
believe it and you're saying it, then you've got a real positive mix. Now, having said that, again, the number 2 item was actually related to small business, and in terms of those belief statements. But what Myra is going to do is now walk through the dynamics of the bill within the state and just the beliefs about pass-through issues. And Myra, let me hand this off to you.
So as Dave was just talking about the importance of believable statements. So in addition to the overall statements about the bill, we took a look at some belief statements specific to the pass-through provisions that were in the bill. These were very strong statements. The first one, tax deductions for small businesses help them to maintain employment, wages, health insurance, and retirement plans. 76% believe that, and among independents, that critical group David was talking about, 71% believe that. So people get what small businesses are able to do with these tax deductions. The second statement, and Brian, this is one of our core belief statements we've been talking about for a long time, that if companies have to pay more in taxes, that those costs will be passed on to consumers in higher prices. That's another statement that people get, with 71% believing that. And then the third statement related to the debate over raising taxes on higher income earners. People believed 67% that with the country still dealing with inflation, that now is not the time to raise taxes. So those were 3 important belief statements that were relevant to the bill and to the 3 provisions relevant to pass-throughs. So in this next section, I'm going to talk about these 3 provisions, how Georgia voters looked at them. 199A, no tax increases on high income earners, and SALT parity. So starting with 199A, we gave people a basic description of what 199A meant, that the one big beautiful bill extended and made it permanent. And how did people respond to that? They responded very positively at 59% favoring that, and that mirrored what we were seeing at the national level as well. Then in terms of no tax increases on higher income earners, in terms of favor or opposing raising the top rate, as a general concept, people on Georgia tended to be negative to that at 35-45. But when we layered on top of that, that it would also apply to small and family-owned businesses in Georgia, like we had seen nationally, the opposition to that concept was increased by about 2 to 1 opposing. Then we're turning to SALT parity, which, as you know, was probably the most challenging of the 3 provisions in the tax bill. Going back to that belief statement about what small businesses are able to do with tax deductions, this was something that voters got. Small and family-owned businesses can deduct their state and local tax payments as a business expense on federal taxes. The bill rejected efforts to block that, and then do people favor that? And 60% favored that, and then among independents, 57% favored. So even on SALT parity, more complicated topic, people did get what that meant. So how important is it to sell the tax bill? And that's something that didn't effectively happen after the 2017 TCJA. So hopefully advocates for this and allies will get it right this time. We're seeing some of the same challenges with this bill that we did see with the TCJA. So just reiterating what David was saying about this very clear-cut contrast about if people think it did or did not prevent a tax increase on them, the very different paradigms for how they view the bill, with 81% favoring the bill if they thought it stopped a tax increase, and then 73% opposed if they didn't. And that also mirrors what we were seeing nationally. Something that we saw back in 2018 with the TCJA is a very similar result for the perception about, did the plan lower taxes for people like them? And that post-election survey we did, only about a third thought that it would, which is a very similar result to what we're seeing now. And unfortunately,
if I could sorry, Myra, just interject. Just about every family in the country got a tax cut under the TCJ.
Right.
So
Yeah.
this isn't that only 36% got a tax cut. No,
Very
everybody got a
frustrating.
tax cut. Only a third of them believe they got a tax cut.
Right. And part of the reason for that was because, unfortunately, most of the campaign messaging that was supposedly selling the tax bill was focused on the concept that Nancy Pelosi was going to take away their tax cut. Yet when only a third of the country thought they got a tax cut, that means that 2/3 of the country didn't think that applied to them. So that messaging really fell flat. So that's something that has to be addressed this time, about making sure people know that this did stop a tax increase. So we're going to show you a couple of before and after reactions. So what's going to change minds about this bill? Is it messaging? We're seeing a lot of ads. So just is it possible to change minds? So we're going to show you two examples. The first is actually from 2018. And in that election, this next speaker represented what might have been termed the holy grail of that election for both parties. She was a suburban female in a competitive district. It was independent. He was likely to vote. She checked all the boxes. So here is her reaction before she knew what was in the TCJA.
I think they're probably what they think is their biggest win is the tax reform. And certainly that was a great tax cut for the corporations. We'll see how it shakes out for the workers and stuff like that.
So not an atypical reaction to that bill. So in the discussion, we passed out a list of the provisions. These were the top 4 at the time. And here's her reaction after she saw what was in the bill.
Can I take a picture of this?
Yeah, I'm going to say, yeah.
Or do we keep this? Is this just for packing plants?
I'll give you, no, there's just a list of the deduction. I'll give you one of these.
You will?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So she was interested, and she was thinking about it. And here's where she ended up after the end of that discussion.
I'm going to go home and have a drink with my husband and tell him about this stuff, because I think it's fascinating. This has been so interesting.
So education about what was in the bill got her thinking about it. She didn't say she was going to change a vote or that she loved the bill, but she was interested, and she was going to go home and talk to her husband about it. So she was much farther down the line about her views of that tax bill than she was going into it. So Dave, I'm going to have you go through a second example.
So from that experience, and again, from the data we had seen, it was, how do we get people to sort of see the specific provisions and sort of understand what happened? And so we came up with this particular chart. And in this, just to let you know where this came from, if you want to go take a look at it, there's a tax parameter spreadsheet on cbo.gov that for January of 2025 that does a very nice job of listing this out. And so the idea was, okay, some people are concerned like, oh, this is too complicated because there's so many numbers. But here's an example of a woman and how she looked at this. And this is how we sort of decided that this potentially could work. And here's her reaction in terms of looking at this chart.
I was surprised on the last panel that you showed us. I had, you'd asked us about taxes, and I thought that things were being put into place that were impacting people that were like households of like 375 to 400K and more. And then what you just showed us on the first page was the 100, which was surprising to me.
So what she did is she didn't look at the whole chart. She did exactly what most people would do. Okay, I make 100,000, so I go down, I look at that, and wow, look, it's going to go from 22 to 25. Being married, then they notice like, wait, my standard deduction just went from 30,000 to 16,000. So they could read the chart very clearly because they knew exactly what they were looking for in the chart, right?
And Dave, if I can interject too, what that also said was everything that she had heard about the bill was that it would only apply to the rich, that it wasn't going to affect her. But then when she saw the provisions of the bill, then she knew it was going to affect her.
So taking that a step forward in terms of using that in this context, and what you're going to do is we're going to do it before and after. So here's a gentleman, and this is what he said about things before he saw that particular chart.
With that said, I don't know all the details of those 2017 cuts. So if I knew what they were, I might have more of an opinion.
Okay. Then after seeing the provisions?
I wasn't aware of all the details of the proposed changes, but to me, it's very clear that keeping the current setup is beneficial to most people than not. I think your examples helped. And I want to know if I'm in favor of keeping this, why the heck politicians aren't using this to their advantage.
Right. And again, it's getting back to what Myra is describing. When you're saying something is being taken away and it hasn't been proven that it's there, they're just that hasn't been put in place yet. And clearly, just as the other woman was, he's open to wanting to hear more. And so we posed in terms of initially, if you remember, the favor or opposed the bill was 45-47. After hearing this, the opposed dropped 11. And it's exactly like that woman responded. This was new piece of information that potentially was believable. They wanted to obviously think through it and potentially fact check it and all that. But the fact that the opposition dropped by 11 points was a huge shift. Because again, you just had these people say they opposed it. And now all of a sudden they were saying they weren't sure of it. And so actually amongst independents, that wasn't just an 11-point drop in terms of the opposed. Amongst independents, it was a 20-point drop. Right. And so you're looking at something that causes people to, in fact, think through this and begin to engage, because for the first time, they've actually gotten some data or information put in front of them they can apply at a personal level. And so with that, I'm going to have Myra, you sort of go through in terms of what's next.
So to just recap where we go from here, now that the bill passed with the 3 great wins for pass-throughs in the tax bill, it will be imperative to define what businesses are now doing with the tax provisions to help increase that percentage that believes that it does affect them. There's an education learning curve nationally, but also on the Hill with pass-through issues. 199A 2.0, Brian, you've outlined some ideas on that. And then building our bench of legislative champions going forward. So as I like to say, Winston Churchill once said, it's not the beginning of the end, but it's the end of the beginning. So yes, we've just come off these great wins, but there's a lot of work ahead to consolidate and to see what's next. So Brian, over to you.
If I can add, I want to add one more thing. I want to go back to this one statement and then I'll put that chart back up. Let me find this, bear with me. Yeah, this one. Okay. And what do they believe that small businesses do? And think about the current argument that you're watching in terms of on the Hill, that these tax deductions for small businesses help them, small businesses, to maintain employment, okay, not bad, wages, health insurance, and retirement plans. If you want to personalize this at a scale, what they're basically saying is small businesses are key to these 4 items. That's a pretty good thing for candidates to be talking about. It's a good thing for obviously small businesses to be talking about, because right now that's about as people are concerned about employment. Wages aren't going up as fast as they want to deal with inflation. Obviously health insurance, given the discourse, and everybody thinking through retirement plans. The fact that small businesses are seen as even just a partial solution to that is a real good positive. So Myra, let me go back to the other screen.
Actually, David, if you could keep it there.
Oh, sorry. Okay,
jump
sorry.
in?
Let me get back to that.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that you mentioned earlier is the inflation discussion, right?
Yep.
And it struck me that, you know, there's a basic disconnect between, say, how somebody like me might talk about inflation and what folks hear. And the disconnect is that when I talk about inflation, I'm talking about the most recent CPI report. And oh, it's only, you know, we're down under 3%. And so inflation is now under control, right? But what the audience hears is, oh, wait a minute, that's not what I see when I go to the grocery store, because the price of eggs is still high because it spiked, you know, in that early period under the Biden administration where you did have significant levels of inflation, and the price hasn't come back down. So for people, they're thinking, wait, defeating inflation is the price goes back down to where it was pre-spike under Biden. For people like me, I'm like, no, that's not how you measure inflation. You measure it moving forward. So there's that disconnect. And it strikes me that, you know, if I'm talking to a group, I'd say, you know, hey, prices are still too high. But one way to avoid them getting even higher is to make sure we're not raising taxes on Main Street businesses, because as you know, if you know, you raise taxes on Main Street businesses, they got to pass those costs on to somebody. That's going to be higher prices to you. And that's how I kind of square that circle, or circle that square, whichever the expression is. Because, you know, I do think that we're talking right past the audience when we talk about inflation being under control. That's not the way they see it. And we need to tie it back to the fact that these tax cuts avoided raising taxes on Main Street businesses, which meant that they don't have to pass on those higher costs to the consumers.
Yeah, and again, people have seen that clearly, particularly in the whole discussion that happened in terms of healthcare, and when the discussion was going about increasing health insurance taxes, you know, in terms of tax. I mean, people immediately understood that's just going to get passed on to me. So this is not a belief system that just emerged. This is a longer term belief system. And actually, Brian, one more thing that I think you'll enjoy. Perhaps one of the best examples of disconnect is when you talk about the core inflation rate and you try to explain to people, well, you know, economists look at the core inflation rate and they take out food and energy, and their immediate response is, oh, food and energy, that's like where like 80% of my budget goes, right? And so it's like, how can you take those two out? So to your point, in terms of particularly focusing on food, and gasoline prices during the Biden era as well. You're looking at the two areas that's what people deal most with, and more importantly, because they're dealing with them on such a frequent basis, there's a real awareness of where those are. So.
Yeah. So if people do have questions, you can use the Q&A button down there. We do have one question, which is actually, I think we just addressed it. If inflation is still the #1 issue, is the tax bill still relevant to that conversation, or could it be? And yeah, I think it's extremely relevant in the sense that people see reducing or keeping taxes low on Main Street businesses is a key component for them not having to pass on those higher costs to their customers, right? And here's a follow-up. Saying the tax bill didn't raise prices doesn't sound like the stronger ground to stand on. Is there a better formulation? Well, that's what I came up with. We'll have to work on something about that.
No, and if I may, Brian, to address that, I mean, one of the things that I look at is in terms of where's the CPI going in terms of the aggregate increase since inaugural month, and where weekly wages are. And right now, where weekly wages are, is there's not enough separation for people to feel that. But that's why when you go back to that one element in terms of one thing they think that the 199A did was to allow for better wages. Okay.
That's a good point.
And so the more wages can increase beyond the inflation rate, the better off things are. And again, since people assign that value to what 199A did in terms of small businesses, that's just a real potential positive. And to your point, that gives a talking point to, you know, in the political discourse that just matters significantly.
And Chris, part of the answer to your question is communicating about what's actually in the bill will help people be able to grasp how it does relate to their personal situation.
Well, you guys all done? Should we wrap it up? All right, excellent. Well, thank you, Myra. Thank you, David. That was terrific. Thanks to everybody for joining. We had a nice, strong turnout. I'm guessing a lot of people with the government shutdown, they had a little time on their hands, so they're able to join us today. Glad you did. We will be posting this on the website so that people that weren't able to join us can also watch it. And as you can imagine, we're going to be talking to some folks because I think this is important information. It needs to get out there, and people need to be reminded that once you pass a bill, you can't just assume that people know what's in the bill. They can't assume that it's going to be well received unless you go out there and sell it. And that's what the Main Street Coalition needs to start doing here. So this is going to be the foundation on which we build that messaging campaign. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
All
you.
right. Ciao.